So this is like the second time that I've recorded this entire section, because the first attempt corrupted itself. Ain't that a hoot? Well anyways, here we are with Addendum number 1. This is basically a collection of a bunch of topics that I realized after recording the demo I had forgotten to cover in sufficient detail in the prior sections. And I don't have the patience to go and try to do the editing work required to shoehorn that information back into the previous sections. So here we're going to cover automation, managing computing resources, rendering in file formats, and then we're going to do a brief demo on basic effect usage. Let's get right into it with automation. Unfortunately, automation is not a way to automatically produce music. What it is a means of automating or programming the way that plugin parameters change over time. This can entail things like the ADSR settings on a synthesizer that you saw in the subtractive synthesis demo, or parameters like volume and pan. Typically, automation is done in the DAW by drawing automation curves for the plugin parameter that you want to control. However, some DAWs like FL Studio also allow you to manipulate automation through the use of clips, much in the way that you would manipulate audio or MIDI clips. In terms of why automation is done, one real obvious use case is when you're recording a voiceover, and perhaps you need your background music to be a little bit louder in some sections or quieter while you're talking. Another obvious use case is if we consider the different sections of a song, with the focus shifting from instrument part to instrument part, based on what section you're in, it may not be appropriate to use the same volume and EQ settings for the same instrument throughout the entire song. So you may want to use automation to adjust the mixing over time so that attention is focused on the right instrument. We can also use automation to create movement and interest, and we can do this by modulating more creative-oriented parameters like panning, reverb mix, or filter cutoff. Now let's talk about dealing with computing resources. The main two resources that you're going to have to deal with are RAM and CPU. Most of the pressure on your RAM is going to come from high-end, high-fidelity sampled instruments, which will make use of many heavily detailed samples. On the other hand, pressure on your CPU mainly comes from fancy synthesizers and fancy effects like delays, reverbs, or tape and amp simulators. Now you can get a vague idea of your RAM and CPU usage by looking at your task manager if you're on Windows. Some plugins, such as Native Instruments Contact, will also give you built-in displays that show you RAM usage. In addition, most DAWs will be able to give you a CPU meter or monitor that will be able to give you an estimate of how much CPU your current project is consuming. However, note that for some DAWs, the number given here is not always accurate, especially on multi-core machines. Now let's talk about ways to economize computing resources, and in particular RAM. Some high-end instruments offer light versions of those instruments, such as Native Instruments Studio Drummer instrument. Typically, these instruments will use fewer samples than the full versions of those instruments, ultimately reducing memory usage, but at the cost of some sampling detail. Another thing that you can do is, if for some reason you need two instances of the same instrument, if that instrument is loaded in an instrument host plugin such as Contact, you can load both of those instances within Contact, and then just use MIDI channels to play the parts separately. Now there are a number of strategies that you can use to economize CPU, one of which is getting a proper hardware audio interface. But aside from that, you can also adjust your playback sample rate in your DAW, which will save you some CPU but lower the quality of your playback audio by making it more difficult for your computer to accurately represent higher frequencies. The other thing you can do is increase your buffer size. Effectively, whenever your computer plays audio, it fills a buffer that it then sends out to your sound card. The larger your buffer size, the more time your CPU has to fill out that buffer. The downside being, the larger the buffer size, the more time your CPU has to fill that buffer, also known as latency. So increasing the buffer size decreases CPU usage at the cost of latency. If we have a relatively CPU-intensive effect plugin that is used on a lot of instruments, say a fancy delay or reverb plugin, one solution that we can use is to route the sound from multiple instruments into one effect, using auxiliary sends and receives. The main drawback of this is, of course, once you've run your auxiliary send signal through that effect, there is no way to separate out the constituent instruments for individual processing afterwards. So if you do this, you're going to have to think about the order of effects that you use. Some plugins, such as VitalSynth, offer quality settings that you can alter to give you more CPU back at the expense of audio quality. In some DAWs, you can bypass or disable plugins that you aren't using in order to stop them from consuming your processing power. Keep in mind that not all DAWs prevent bypass plugins from consuming CPU. The last CPU economizing strategy that I want to talk about is rendering, also known as freezing or bouncing. The principle of this strategy is that it is easier for your computer to process uncompressed raw audio than it is for your computer to process things through plugins. We can effectively eliminate the CPU usage from a very resource-intensive instrument and effects chain by simply rendering out the sound produced by that instrument into a simple, easy-to-process audio clip, and then disabling the resource-intensive instrument and effects chain. Of course, once we've baked everything down into that audio clip, if we want to make changes to anything like the notes played or the effect settings used that were baked into that audio clip, you're going to have to re-render the whole thing over again. And that provides us with a good segue point into rendering. If you want to turn your project into a music file that you can distribute, you're going to have to render it. And you can render your project into many different file formats. There is a great deal of technical detail involved in discussing the different file formats, as well as a great deal of debate regarding which one is the best. I can't adequately cover all the angles of this debate, but I can give you my opinion. Generally, when you are editing audio, it is best to work with good old uncompressed wave. It's going to eat up a lot of file storage space, but also, working with uncompressed audio puts less of a load on your CPU, because it doesn't have to do the work of decompressing that might be involved with another format, like for example, FLAC. FLAC uses a special kind of compression known as lossless audio compression, meaning that it can achieve the same fidelity as a WAV file, but with a smaller file size. Generally, the performance hit that you get from decompressing FLAC in real time isn't really relevant if the only thing that you're doing is listening to music. So FLAC is preferred for hi-fi playback, and FLAC is the format that I use for album distribution. Now let's get into the lossy compression formats. These are the formats where we start trading off more in quality in exchange for smaller file sizes. The famous MP3 format is probably the lowest quality of the formats that I've listed here. Generally, it will have more problems trying to reproduce high-frequency information. However, I also find that posting my files in the form of an MP3 on Smutty seems to get me the most views, and I suspect this is because people don't recognize other file formats as being sound files, which I further blame on marketers referring to music players as MP3 players for the past 2 decades. But because it's so popular, MP3 is pretty much supported everywhere. So I guess that makes it the Chad of the file formats. Now, Ogg Vorbis can achieve better quality than MP3 at lower file sizes, and Ogg Opus can achieve even higher file quality at lower file sizes. The only issue is, my DAW does not allow me to directly export to Ogg Opus, and good luck getting either of the Ogg formats to play in certain web browsers or media players. I do like Ogg Vorbis as a listening format to save space on my phone though. There are many other audiophile formats out there, but I really don't know enough about them to say anything definitive. Last part about rendering settings, let's talk about sample rate, bit depth, and bit rate. These are all technical terms with actual meanings, but from our perspective as music producers, all we need to know is that they affect the quality of our final product. Having a higher sample rate, bit depth, and bit rate will all give us better quality at the expense of larger file size. For most consumer applications, a sampling rate of 48 kHz and a bit depth of 24 bits is adequate. When it comes to bitrate settings, the particular bitrate that is considered adequate depends on the format. My recommendations are listed on this slide. I tend to err on the side of higher quality and larger file sizes. Now let's get into the usage of basic effects. Let's start off with compression, taking a look at the Native Instruments Supercharger Compressor, which I use not just because of the meme, but because it's got this giant knob in the center that says compress. The more you turn this knob up, the more compression you get. That is, the more the loud sounds are compressed downwards. Pretty fucking simple. Now if you take a look at this output volume meter on the right, what you'll notice is that when we compress our signal down, the resulting sound is unsurprisingly a lot lower in volume than the sound that we started out with. So in order to bring our sound back to that original level, we gotta dial up the output. That gets us that net effect where we make the quiet sounds louder. Now I'm going to reset these options. Now in most plugins you're going to be able to reset these parameters to their default values just by double clicking on them. Now let's go ahead and disable the supercharger, and I'm going to bring in a second compressor with some parameters that are more generalizable to other compressor plugins. What we see on the top left here are 2 important controls of a compressor: threshold and ratio. You may remember from back in the mixing section that a compressor reduces a sound when it goes above a certain threshold. This threshold knob controls exactly that. We can take a look at this gain reduction meter on the right side to see how much our sound is being compressed. Right now it's being compressed maximum around 5 decibels. But let's turn our threshold all the way down and see how that affects the gain reduction. As you can see, we're running a lot quieter. Again, if we want that original volume back, we're gonna have to rely on the makeup gain knob on the top right. Now this compressor is a bit more customizable than the supercharger compressor. We have a second knob on the left here called ratio. And what that does is control the amount of gain reduction that occurs once our sound goes above the threshold. Right now we are at a relatively low ratio of 1.5, but if we crank that up, we're getting a lot more gain reduction. Now it's time to talk about these bottom two settings, attack and release. Attack describes how quickly the gain reduction occurs once the sound has exceeded the threshold. We can use a fast attack time to really squash down the signal, or a very slow attack time, which will allow the first few milliseconds of each drum hit to pass through uncompressed and result in a punchier or clickier sound. Release is how quickly the gain reduction or compression decays once our sound has fallen below that threshold. Fast releases can be used to assist with punchiness, whereas slow releases can be used for more even, consistent control of dynamics. Next, let's talk about EQ. I'm going to unmute this synth sound. What I have here is a semi-parametric EQ. Essentially, it offers me a fixed collection of filters and bands, whose frequencies I can adjust slightly within a certain range in order to sculpt my sound. I have low-pass filters and high-pass filters. I have low shells, which allow me to boost or cut all the frequencies below a particular frequency. As well as high shells, which do the same thing for frequencies above the high shell frequency. As well as two mid-range peak notch bands, which allow me to apply a boost or cut centered around a particular frequency. I can also use this control in the middle to adjust the width of the frequency range that is modified by the peak notch filters. A narrower peak or notch will result in a more obvious equalization effect, where you can almost hear the frequency that is being boosted or cut. Whereas a wider band will be much more subtle. Now let's talk about gating, but first let's bring in this guitar. Let's add the gate in. Recall from the mixing section that gates only allow sound in if it exceeds a certain threshold. In this case, you can see on the UI that a guitar is not actually exceeding the gate threshold level used, that is, the big moving blue square is not crossing the solid blue line, and therefore no sound is being allowed through. So we're going to have to lower the threshold. Now if we crank our attack time up, effectively what that does is it makes the gate wait before it opens. In other words, it makes the gate ignore the initial portion of a signal, kinda similar to a compressor. Let's isolate our guitar so we can hear it better. So you can use that to alter the characteristics of your sound. Hold affects how long the gate is held open after the signal falls below the threshold. And the release describes how long the gate takes to decay back down to the closed state after the input signal has fallen below threshold. Now let's bring in reverb. The main parameter to modify with reverb is reverb mix, how much of the signal is dry, that is, the unmodified signal, and how much of it is wet, or the reverberated signal. The exact effects of the parameters that we see on the left here vary from plugin to plugin. Either the size or the decay parameter should increase the length of the reverb tail, giving the impression of being in a larger space. Pre-delay introduces a delay between the dry or original sound and the reverberated sound. Generally, a higher pre-delay setting will also give the impression of being in a larger space, as well as increase intelligibility of the dry signal. We're not going to worry about these middle parameters for now. Instead, let's move on to delays. I'm going to unmute the synth sound for us to use our delay on. Again, I'm using a Native Instruments plugin here, Replica, because it's got a simple but powerful user interface. This big knob that we see in the center controls the delay time. As we turn this down, notice that our delays get tighter around the original note. You may notice from this text down here that the delay time is actually being synchronized to the tempo of the piece, but we could always use an arbitrary time instead. The feedback setting down here describes how much the delayed signal is fed back into itself at a lower volume. If we lower feedback down to 0, we're only going to get one delay tail. This last setting down here is a bunch of stereo settings for a delay. The wide setting applies a chorused effect to the delayed signal to make it sound wider in the stereo image. Ping Pong, on the other hand, uses offset delays between the left ear and the right ear, and Normal just does the delay in mono. So that's how all that sounds together. The last thing that we're going to take a look into is a technique called Sidechain Compression. What Sidechain Compression is instead of compressing a sound based on the volume of that sound in particular, you can compress a sound based on the volume of another sound. So it allows you to squash the volume of one sound while another sound is being played. We're going to use a synth track to demonstrate this. And we're going to sidechain it to these drums. First, we need a compressor. Then we need to use the DAW's routing to set up the drums as a sidechain input into that compressor. Note that if I play right now, no sidechain compression is happening. As we can see based on the gain reduction meter, the compression is still based on the volume of the synth. The reason for this is that we also have to configure the compressor to use the sidechain input rather than the normal input. So what you'll notice now is that our compressor is compressing based on the volume of the drums. We tweak a few settings. Let's listen to it with the sidechain compression off, and with the sidechain compression on. What you can hear is that the volume of the synth is being reduced whenever the drums play. A common technique in electronic music production is to sidechain a track, most commonly the sub bass or pads, to the kick drum, which helps the kick drum stand out more in the mix. Alright, that's all I wanted to say about basic effects. See you next video for the demo.